I think as the governor properly mentions that the institution is there to ensure that the vulnerable do it. That is in accordance to the monetary policy. But I think the monetary policy, so if you just have to perhaps just look at the 2008 period, the unemployment was not as rife as it is today. So today's conditions, they are quite different when we are seeing this high interest rate that are supposedly going to curb the inflation rate, particularly to protect those who are at the bottom of the margins in the scale of economy, or being able to have that purchasing power. But I think also what is quite interesting as we enter this hyperinflation phase is that the balance really to ensure that there is a balance between borrowing and also the purchasing power. Currently, also, when you have to look at the data around access to basic services or basic needs, let me rather say the basic needs, it is the poorest that are actually much more in need of that credit to procure those basic needs. About 43% of those who are in the low income bracket utilize credit to purchase those basics, the basic foods. In fact, that 43%, I think it just goes to foods, and then it reduces as you go on to the other needs. So I think of an interesting point right now is that in the 2021, when you had an unrest, which was also as a result of the unemployment and the rising inflation at that time as well, and also the conditions having not changed, I'm quite keen and curious to figure out the monetary policy when there is little being done to change the conditions. How is the model of increasing the interest rate in our context going to ensure that those who are vulnerable and in the bottoms of the margins are really protected, as the governor says that the increase of interest rate is really to ensure that it keeps up with the inflation rate, but also where we know that in South Africa currently, I think the value for us to say you are at least in the amount that you require for you to at least say you are at the poverty line, it's almost 1,000 rand. But then, we still are struggling to even achieve the UBIC, the Universal Basic Income Guarantee. So it's going to be quite an interesting policy to debate, I think, and also in absence of other interventions that can really put in those protective mechanisms outside just the monetary policy to ensure that the vulnerable are really protected.
And let's focus a little bit more on the vulnerable, the poverty cycle. We know that those born into poverty very rarely come out of it, that it's a minuscule number who manage to escape it. Given the current conditions, as you mentioned, that it's the poor that suffer the most because the high cost of borrowing is passed on particularly to consumers, those who can ill afford it. And we're often told that government spends so much money on grants to help alleviate the plight of those who really don't have. With the high unemployment levels, are we seeing it have a positive effect? Or is this in itself also a vicious cycle where government is spending, but the impact is little felt?
So it is a vicious cycle, and hence I'm using words like intervention. So some social innovation interventions will be required. So I think at this point in time where South Africa is, we are unable to dodge the bullet of creating those jobs and finding means of creating them outside government. I mean, you can imagine in a society where you have poor quality education and access to it, and even the resources or infrastructure, it really just triples the burden of really getting out of that cycle. So it's going to take government also investing in infrastructure that can ensure that can at least stimulate creation of those jobs outside just really government institutions. But then there needs to be a programmatic and systematic approach to ensuring that those interventions programs that will intervene for those in the margins are really built. I think currently certain policy instruments in South Africa that are really geared towards innovation, are placed very much into established firms. So we need to look into such policies that are intended for social impact, for transformation of the economy, whether they can really be implemented at the bottom and also be monitored in such a way that the context at the bottom can be understood and be matched to that. Because in all honesty, it does not make sense to always just be putting in money towards certain, particularly I think for just social grants, when there are no programs to absorb those who are on the social grants to move into the employment, or also put in some incentives for those who are trying to create jobs for others in their communities. So I think at this point in time, really, it's not a moment where we have to overly rely on state, but then we're required to change, and actively so and proactively so, we have to change how we operate in our communities, and how we can downscale or upscale some of the interventions in order for us to see that impact and the change at the bottom.
I mean, we often get told that perhaps we need to look back at cooperatives of the past. You mentioned earlier on how the number of people who actually rely on credit for basic needs is high. I think the figure is, I'm just looking at an index here that says it puts it about 43% of those who try and gain credit to simply buy food. So how are people then expected to be innovative, have an entrepreneurial spirit, if we're being told that it's possible that we haven't even reached the ceiling of the rate hikes, and that in turn means the debt burden is growing exponentially?
Yeah, really the entrepreneurial part is quite an interesting one and very much needed one. And I think, people are trying out there. And really with this kinds of statistics and indices, it makes it very difficult to imagine. But I think that being organized, utilizing the energy that we utilize for the civil unrest towards really building mechanisms of accountability and responsibility, because at the end of the day, I think when you are looking at unemployment rate of more than 40%, and also having to spend most of the credit on just food, and also still struggling with the access to food, I think we are really getting to realize that capitalism also as it is, it's really failing us. So thinking about this entrepreneurial ventures, also where in South Africa, you really have a thin base of investors. The ecosystem of investors is quite thin. The ecosystem of those who seek to collaborate to ensure that these entrepreneurial ventures do succeed is also quite thin. So I think really in absence of an intervention personally from myself, but I do believe that being organized and really ensuring that we can engage in these debates from time to time and figure out how we can possibly turn around the wheel, because I honestly don't see, it's quite difficult for South Africa currently to be hopeful. It's really quite difficult. But then I do think that it's time not to lose hope, but then to really just go back to the structures and organize properly with the public, private institutions, also within the international organizations. But I think also with the international organizations, what I just want to highlight is that it cannot always be that we over-rely on them as well, because we're always having to respond to the context that favors the international funders or donor multinational donor organizations, whereas we are failing to understand how we can create that ecosystem of investors or funders in the country currently.